Hello, my name is Bob Brown, and it's my privilege to host this show, which is based on the reality that Westborough is a great town filled with interesting people. Many of them are long-term residents who have so many memories and stories about life in Westborough in days gone past. And so your local cable station, Westborough TV, has initiated this series of programs which are designed to reflect upon life in earlier days and to possibly make suggestions about how we can improve life in this fine town for the future. Well, once again, I'm privileged to have Kris Allen with us to share some more of the stories about Westborough. The last time she was here, we highlighted her book, which I'd like to do again. This is an important book for this town, and I think it's too often forgotten. And she's promised, if we keep pressure on her, to write another chapter for the book, to bring it up to date. But the last time Kris came, she shared a little bit of the early history of Westborough. And today she's agreed to talk about some of the great personalities, the great personages who have lived in this town and contributed so much to it, either because they were characters or because they did something significant.
So, most of them were characters.
Well, that's fine.
And did something
That's right.
significant.
We're all characters, so let's go with it.
All right. Well, I was thinking this time it would be interesting to talk about some of the people know well and some facts that they may not know about them, as well as some people that aren't well recognized, and probably not taking it right up until the 1900s, because that might be another topic of those who are in the 20th century who are well known, but those who were here in the 18th and 19th century. And one of the very early settlers of Westborough were Daniel and Martha Shattuck, and most people don't know their story, which is fascinating. It turns out that Daniel lived in Marlborough while Westborough was part of Marlborough, and I think everybody knows or should know that Westborough got its name because it is the West Borough of Marlborough. And the towns were together in the early 1700s, and Daniel Shattuck lived in Marlborough. And during that time were the French and Indian Wars, and actually Queen Anne's War. And at that time, the Indians that were living around Montreal and were part of the French colony in Montreal had been trained by missionaries to hate the English and were siding with the French against the English. So in these wars, a lot of the Indians who lived along Montreal came down in raids in the colonies. But one of the problems too was that their tribes had been decimated by disease, probably brought by the white colonists.
The settlers, yeah.
So therefore, the Indians did not have young men, and a lot of their sons and children have been killed by disease. So they were interested in kidnapping children and bringing them back to their tribes and their villages in Canada. So in 1702, Daniel Shattuck fell in love with this 16-year-old Martha, who lived in Worcester, actually. And he was courting her and came to their home in Worcester and found that her father, Diggory, had been massacred, and her mother and the 5 children had been kidnapped by Indians during this raid. So he rallied his friends in Marlborough and got a party together to go find Martha and her brothers and sisters. And they set out, and they followed the Indians up to the border of Vermont and Canada, I believe. And then everyone went home but Daniel. And Daniel, for the next 7 years, looked for Martha.
Wow.
And he finally found her. And this is still a story, but the story is that he found her. She was living with maybe Iroquois Indians, and they captured him and bound him up and put him in a wigwam and were going to kill him. And Martha, in the middle of the night, somehow sneaked out and got underneath the wigwam tent and freed him. Wow. Then he and Martha grabbed ammunition and whatever weapons they could, burned all the canoes, or destroyed all the canoes, probably not burned them, but destroyed all the canoes but one, and got out of there in a canoe, and paddled for their lives and escaped. And eventually they were married in 1719 and came to settle in Westborough. But that's sort of a story of amazing bravery and love and persistence. And the Shaddocks.
Does that name have any connection with the pharmacy? Shattuck?
It may, very well, because Shattuck is an old name, obviously, in these areas. But
that's great. That's a great story.
And then the other stories that go along with the wars, the French and Indian Wars, is the most famous one, which is the story of the Rice Boys. And everyone who walks along the West Main Street goes by the high school and the monument that's right near this little brook that says in 1704 the Rice Boys were kidnapped here. And it was also the part of the same wars that the French missionaries near Montreal had missionary towns. And in this case, the Cagnawaga village had Iroquois Indians in it, and they sent Indians down to fight the colonists. And in August 8th, 1704, according to Reverend Parkman's diary, there were people who were spreading flax out to dry because they would spin flax into linen and they had to cut it down and dry it. And while they were doing this, these Indians came down the hill, which is called Grindstone Hill, behind the high school, came down the hill and grabbed 5 Rice boys. Now, these were the sons of Thomas Rice, who lived where the high school is now. He had 2 sons, Asher and Adajana, and he lived in a garrison house. And the 3 nephews of his, also Rice's son of Edmund, and they were Silas, Timothy, and Nahor. And they were grabbed and taken away while the rest of the people ran for cover in the garrison. Nahor was only 5 years old, so I guess he couldn't make the trip. So he was killed actually on the spot and found and buried in the center of town where our old cemetery is.
Is it really?
And that's why the cemetery across from the town hall is Memorial Cemetery, but it was first called Grave Plain, and that's where Nahor Rice is buried. Although we think it's the southwest corner, but the marking is gone now. But that's how that became a cemetery in town back in 1704. Then the rest of the boys were taken up to Canada and taken to this missionary village where the Indians lived. One of them, Adajana, grew up, had a farm in Montreal and married a French woman. However, Thomas Rice, who lived at this high school garrison house, where the high school is now, ransomed his house, sold his house to get ransom to bring back one of his sons, Asher. And he built him a home in 1720 where Mrs. Grove lives at Dennybrook Farm.
Oh, is that right?
And that house was built for Asher when he came back and was ransomed back. And
is that the original house?
That's the original house.
Wow.
And I think it had maybe moved across from Denny Street to where it is now on South Street. But Asher never was right after being kidnapped by the Indians and was always very fearful and couldn't make a success of his farm, and I think eventually moved away. The other boys, however, went up to Canada and became part of the Iroquois tribes. And Silas was, I guess, married an Indian woman and stayed there. But Timothy was the youngest one. When he was kidnapped, I believe, he was only 7. And the chief's son had been killed or had died because of the diseases. And so he adopted Timothy, who was the youngest Rice boy to be kidnapped. And I guess he trained him to be a chief. And according to Reverend Parkman, Timothy Rice was known for his courage and his persistence and his warlike character. So he became one of the sachems or leaders of the 6 nations of the Iroquois. And a very, I guess, wonderful young man, and came back here in 1740, back to his hometown, but wasn't able to speak English anymore, but did recognize places and I guess some people. And what was interesting is that his legacy continued on through the Revolution, because in the Revolution, again, the Iroquois Indians and French Indians were asked to fight against, this time, against the colonists in England, English colonists here. And they absolutely refused to fight against the New England English because they said a lot of our chiefs are related and come from Timothy Rice, and they weren't going to fight their relatives.
I was wondering about that, whether he came back as a less hostile Indian than the ones who had taken him.
Well, according to the stories, that he did, and that they did not want to fight against the colonists here because of that. And there have been Rice descendants of Timothy Rice and others of the Rice family who have come to visit Westborough and to see the homesteads, the Rice homesteads, during, I think, the 200th anniversary of and 250th anniversary of Westborough. And
there was a fellow who lived on South Street, Charlie Rice. Would he have been a relative, you think?
There were a lot of Rices in town.
Yeah, were there?
Yeah, and not all of them were kidnapped. For
Yeah, right.
instance. So,
Yeah.
so there were some Rices that lived out on, I believe, Rugglestown and Mount Pleasant, and other Rices that were
That's
survived.
interesting, yeah. That property where you said that he was kidnapped from has quite a history in itself, doesn't it?
It does.
And the Aronson family was there.
Well, what was interesting, it's a great place, but it has a lot of stories to it, starting off with the 1704 Indian kidnapping. But later it became a show place of, in the Industrial Revolution, because a Christopher Whitney, who probably in some way was related to Eli Whitney, was an entrepreneur. And he started a box factory downtown. This is in the late 1800s. And that box factory was called the Bartlett Box Factory, and that was when everything was shipped in boxes,
Sure,
obviously.
yeah.
So it was a big factory downtown. And he made a lot of money. So Christopher Whitney built a showcase mansion where the high school is now.
Is that right?
Yeah. And it had cupolas and little gazebos, and it was beautifully landscaped. We have some of its photographs in the Historical Society.
Great.
And that house was featured in a novel by William Dean Howells called Annie Kilbourne. And it's written, the novel is situated in Hatboro, and Hatboro, because Westborough made all these straw hats, is Westborough.
Is that right?
And it's supposedly set in that house.
Wow.
So that was the story of this wonderful mansion. But later, I believe in the early 1900s and the 1920s through 1930s, the Aronson family moved in. I'm not sure exactly when they moved in, but they had a cattle farm there.
Right.
And according to people who tell me about who had cattle, Bob Harvey and others, that cattle would be driven up West Main Street to the Harveys and also to the Aronson farm, and there would be cattle auctions. Can you just imagine cattle being driven up West Main Street?
Yeah.
And according to Bob and some others, the boys would throw firecrackers and have them stampede up West Main Street and die. Wild West. Maybe that's why Westborough Rangers are Westborough Rangers. I never could figure that out. But in any case, the Aronsons had a large cattle farm, and in 1953, on June 9th, I believe it was when the tornado came. And it came right across West Main Street, right where the Aronsons lived, and cut a swath right in behind that. And when I was talking to Priscilla Miller, who grew up in the house across the street, she said that she heard terrible, once the tornado had hit, people were rapping at her door and asking to get in and really wailing. And it turned out that it was one of the hired men who had been hired to work at the Aronson farm from the Midwest. And he said he thought he had gotten away from tornadoes, but here one had killed one of his farm workers, and also, I believe, Mrs. Aronson and a daughter was killed. So it was totally destroyed. The house was destroyed. So after that disaster and Indian kidnappings, I guess we decided to build the high school there.
No, there was an interim there.
What happened in between?
Well, we grew up on Forbes Street. I mean, my family grew up on Forbes Street. The family we raised is on Forbes Street. And our kitchen was set in a juxtaposition that there was an oven, an in-wall oven that had a glass front on it. And the kids used to sit there getting their lunch or their supper, and they could look in the glass and see the cattle grazing on the hill. So when we came to town in '59, it was still a pasture.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, cows all over it.
Good. All right.
And the other part that's fascinating to me is if you look at the front walk going into the high school off West Main Street, it goes over a little bridge, a nice stonework bridge that's just been rebuilt. And that was the original Ruggles Street, they tell me. And if you follow it out far enough, when you get out to where the ski slope was, you see the ski slope come down and then have a jet like that, and the road went across.
Okay.
And then moving up across that to my son Jimmy's house, which was the Haberate farm, the street came right across in front of that house.
Interesting.
And there's some fascinating foundations up in there of massive old buildings that
Wonderful.
sometime we'd like to find some more history about. But
it'd be good. I think that place is on the old maps as being a nursery too, way back. So, and I don't know, I know the little bridge, the stone bridge over the brook that runs through the high school area now is all landscaped. And I thought that may have been an entrance to this mansion. See, I don't know. And then it could have curved around, because I know that it is now a memorial, and Joe Ventriglia has just redone it for the town. It's very beautiful. So the whole, in fact, I was sitting there yesterday, and it's a beautiful place to sit because there's a lovely lawn and a brook going across. And I'm sure not many people sit in the high school little area.
There's one beautiful time of the year when the daffodils come out, and they're all spotted along that brook. And I think one of the projects they used to have at the school was the art class would come out and they'd paint those. Sit on the lawn and just paint.
What a great idea.
Yeah.
It's a very important spot for Westborough.
It really is.
And a historic spot for Westborough. And a lot of interesting things are happening there now as well. So I think more people should take advantage of wandering around the high school.
There's so many fascinating things in town that we just take for granted or don't stop to take a look at. Like the memorial for the Rices that's right there. It tells quite a story.
There are other monuments in town that people can go to see, and obviously one of the most famous ones is the one at Eli Whitney's home. People may not know that that's not his home. His home was taken down in the 1830s. It was a salt box, I believe. But the stone that's there is his front step, and there's a monument on the stone. So that I, like to imagine Eli Whitney going back and forth and walking on that stone.
Yeah.
You said you thought there was a...
Well, there's right across the street, there's maybe just a foundation, a stone foundation for a garage or something. It seems to me, I remember that. It's all grown up now, so it's hard to tell. But.
Well, Eli Whitney was born in December 8th, 1825. And his father was a blacksmith farmer. He could have had a blacksmith shop there. And his mother was Betsy Fay. And I give Betsy Fay all the credit for his Eli Whitney Jr.'s entrepreneurial talent and smarts, because she refused to marry Eli Whitney Sr. until she had a dowry. And she grew up at Wilkinson's. The Captain John Fay was her grandfather on West Main Street. And the way she got a dowry was that she planted winter rye and got her friends to help cut it and dry it and split it and braid it, and she began making straw hats.
Wow.
And she was one of the first straw hat manufacturers in Westborough way back in the 1760s.
Great.
And she sold enough hats to make enough money to get married to Eli Whitney Sr. So I think she was a clever one in the family.
She was.
So they moved around to where Eli Whitney Street is now, and their son was born. And he was very intelligent and used to, I think, there are stories of him taking clocks apart and putting them back together for fun, and during the Revolution helping his father as a blacksmith and making nails during the Revolution, I guess, because that was really important during the Revolution. And helping his mother by drawing out a nail into a hat pin, and then helping that fashion of hat pins and keeping straw hats on with hat pins. So she, because of her straw hat manufacturing and his ability to make hat pins.
It's a patient man to take a piece of steel like that and keep spreading it out.
Well, I bet it is. He maybe had a lot of patience. But at the Historical Society, we have a wooden hat block that who knows, was carved by Eli Whitney for his mother, but at least that's the story, that it was Eli Whitney's mother's hat block for forming her straw hats. Well, Betsy Fay died when her son was only 12, when Eli Whitney was 12. And his father remarried, and his stepmother was not particularly interested with Eli going on to college or school. I think they felt he should stay on the farm, help his father, the farming and being a blacksmith. But Eli was determined to go to college.
Now, he was the only child?
No, I think there were some other children, but at least the only child, I believe, of Betsy Fay.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway, he was the smartest, obviously, the most. And he was determined to go to college, and so he went and he taught at Leicester Academy for 5 years to earn money for his tuition, and then went to Yale at age 23, which was pretty old.
That's right.
And studied at Yale and graduated, and when he graduated, he got a job as a tutor in Georgia. Why Georgia, I don't know. But he traveled to Georgia and met a very influential woman, Catherine Greene, who was the wife of a Revolutionary hero. And I guess at some dinner at Mulberry Grove, her home, they were discussing the fact that it was very difficult to grow a certain kind of cotton, I think it's called green seed cotton, because it was so hard to get the seeds out of this cotton. And yet this was the type of cotton that could be grown all over the South in the interior and other places, but had not been grown because it was so difficult to get the seeds out. So Eli Whitney, clever young man that he was, said, develop a machine that'll take seeds out of cotton. And sure enough, in short order, developed the cotton gin. Also, he received a patent for that in 1794.
Did he really? Yeah.
And according to the National Archives, when I went down to the National Archives, you look at the patent for the cotton gin, and it says it's invented by Eli Whitney of Westborough, and it allowed the South to begin growing this green seed cotton all over. And the U.S. became the largest producer of cotton because of this, because they could now cultivate lands they hadn't been able to before with cotton. And according to that, slavery became more and more vital and increased slavery because they had to have more slaves.
Sure.
And the National Archives said, really attributed the cotton gin for having allowed the South to get richer and richer and then have enough money to feel that they could succeed. So an invention like that can have amazing ramifications. But poor Eli never really got any money from the cotton gin because it was so simple a device that people began knocking off all over the place. And there were cotton gins, every farm in the South had a cotton gin. And he came back to New Haven, where he had set up a factory for cotton gins with his partner and classmate, I guess, Phineas Miller, and was fighting court battles all the time to get money from the cotton gin, when in 1798 the government needed to have some muskets manufactured, and 10,000 to 15,000 muskets. And Eli Whitney, I don't know why he did this, but he said, I can make those muskets. And he got the contract. I can just imagine him saying, how am I going to make 15,000 muskets? But what he did do was he was one of the early pioneers of mass production and mass assembly. And he had devised various patterns and templates for the different parts of a musket. And before then, muskets had been made individually, one artisan per gun. So he set up a Whitney Arms Company right outside of New Haven in a place called Whitneyville, Mill Village. And he's established producing guns on mass assembly and assembly line with interchangeable parts. And he was able, I guess, to make the contract. And this went on to be a major rifle company and arms company, and during the late 1700s, early 1800s. He didn't get married for a long, long time. He was a bachelor. And because of that, he brought down his nephews from Westborough. Yeah, and they lived sort of across from the high school on West Main Street. It was Elihu Blake, Eli Blake, and another Blake, I've forgotten his name, Philos Blake. And they went and helped their uncle run the Whitney Arms Factory. And one of them, Eli Whitney Blake, named for his famous uncle, turned out to be a great inventor himself and invented locks and a stone crushing machine that was used all over. And he was one of the founders of the Connecticut Academy of Sciences. So he was a very bright man too, and he grew up in Westborough. And then Eli got married when he was 51 and had a son, but died about 8 years later in 1825.
Who
so
Eli did?
Eli Whitney, the inventor, did. And he's buried in New Haven, but that's why his nephews had come down to take over the company.
He never came back here to live then?
He never came back here to live, but I think he used his money to dig up all his wonderful Puritan graves. I don't think I've forgiven Eli Whitney for this, because we have beautiful hand-carved Puritan gravestones in the Memorial Cemetery. And when he had the money, he dug up all those graves or moved the gravestones and put this great monument to the Whitney family in the corner of Memorial Cemetery. He's not buried there, but all his relatives are memorialized in that stone. So he did something that wasn't quite right at that point.
But his invention was far more than just deciding how to make a product. He allowed people with various skills to participate together. It seemed to me that, as I read the history, that so many of the old-time farmers had to do everything themselves. They had to be jack of all trades. What mass production did was say you can concentrate on one item, learn how to make it and do it well, and then another person will do another another person, and then, as Henry Ford showed us, how to put them all together in an assembly line, and you could use less skilled labor, teaching them one particular skill, and still produce a quality product.
Right, it was
Fascinating.
really an important part of the Industrial Revolution
really
that
was.
then put labor out to people and opened that out. His mill village, you can visit. It's near Haddam, Connecticut, I believe, and it has some of the housing that they had for the people who worked in the
Great.
mills, and there was schooling, and you know, it was their whole life was spent in this mill village in Whitneyville.
That's great.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And he wasn't the first to do mass assembly or mass production. There were others too, Slater Mills and others, but he was one of the first and a pioneer.
Yeah, but if you think about all the pieces that go into making a musket,
I don't know what goes into making a musket.
there's a lot of forging and casting and all kinds of stuff. It's fascinating to me. I think that stuff is neat.
What I think is neat is how does a young farm boy in Westborough grow up to do this kind of thing? Ingenuity is fascinating, and entrepreneurship.
Well, I think a large part of it was just the way they had to be raised on the farm. We have Bobby has a favorite cousin who came out of Hodgson, Maine, who was one of many children raised in a 2-bedroom house. And they had their sustenance was the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And old Mr. Duff used to say to the son, he'd say, Leon, go get the tractor. And Leon said, I never drove it. Go, learn how to do it. Don't do anything wrong, but get the tractor going. And so there was no here's how you do it, this is what you do, just follow me. It was, go find out, go figure it out. He'd come back and say, Dad, I got the tractor stuck in a hole. Well, how are you going to get it out?
Yeah.
It sounded like cruel treatment for a kid, but it left that spirit that you got to solve the problem yourself. You've got to figure it out. And I think we've lost some of that by always having manuals and things. How are you going to fix
done
it?
for us or exactly. So, well, another inventor in Westborough. What's interesting is also Eli Whitney is well known in Europe, because I remember speaking to some European friends of mine, and they knew who Eli Whitney was. And when I said he was born in Westborough, I said, oh, so he's well known everywhere else. And to find him in the National Archives was interesting too. But
my relatives in Scotland knew Eli Whitney was born in Westborough.
So let's hope all our school children know that Eli Whitney was born in Westborough. Another person who is in Washington, in the Smithsonian, is Gardner Parker. And Gardner Parker was a clockmaker in town. Again, in the 1700s, he grew up on Mill Road. There was a grist mill on Mill Road where the Assabet went through, and his father bought that as a grist mill. And when he was 14 in the 1780s or so, he was apprenticed to the Willard brothers in Grafton, the clockmakers. And he would walk from Mill Road over to Grafton and spent many years being an apprentice. And again, the Willards were famous for inventing the banjo clock and other fine clocks. And so Gardner Parker learned his craft very, very well. And I believe in 1790 or so, finished his apprenticeship and came back to Westborough and set up shop on the corner of Blake Street and West Main Street. And he began to make clocks. And one of the fine clocks he made was the tower clock for the meeting house.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and the meeting house was the second meeting house built in 1749 downtown. And he made this huge mechanism, and I always thought a tower clock would be sort of a big thing going, vertical. It's a huge lateral thing. It's an amazing mechanism. And that tower clock is in the Smithsonian Institute.
Right.
And when I was there several years ago, they had opened a brand new exhibit called On Time. And the first thing you see as you walk in is Gardner Parker's tower clock from Westborough, Massachusetts. And sort of celebrating how ingenious it was and how important it was. And it was the way the town, I guess, kept time. Yeah. And it was moved over, I believe, to the old town hall in 1839. It's not there now, but it was very important. So Gardner Parker continued to make clocks, and I guess he made locks, and he thought that he could do some steam-powered machinery. So what he did is he, in, I believe, 1805 to about 1815, tried to build a steam power factory at the end of Heath Street, where there's a pond.
Right.
And unfortunately, there wasn't enough water power to run the water wheels to make it happen. And that's why at the end of Heath Street is called Parker's Folly.
Right.
And unfortunately, he committed suicide also at age 44 in 1816. And Folly Lane and Parker's Folly are all part of the Gardner Parker story. Right. It actually, I believe in the 1800s, was a place people went on picnics right from downtown.
Spot.
It is a beautiful spot. And there are old photographs of Parker's Folly, and I think people just used to walk out because it's right near the center of town and have Sunday walks or picnics at Parker's Folly. But that's the folly, was that he wasn't able.
Just not enough power of the water, right?
Yeah. But we have several of his clocks in town, I believe. There's one at the Historic Commission, there's one in the Historical Society that have Gardner Parker on them.
But as you look at that dam, it looked to me as if they were trying to follow the principle that you might not have much water, but if you put it up high enough to fall down far enough, you could turn the wheel. That wheel must have been well down with the scuppers on it. So they did the best they could.
I love the word scupper. It must have had a scupper or two.
Well, they were all scuppers. They caught the water.
Scuppers that go up around the wheel?
The water would catch and they would run out and dump and other
And I guess the wheel was too heavy, all kinds of things, but he wasn't able to pull it off. But he did make beautiful clocks, and his tower clock is celebrated in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, somebody from Westborough.
Now, speaking of mills, the one out on just after you go past the dump, on the right-hand side, I think Bob Hennessy owned it most recently. There was a water wheel and a house.
A Piccadilly Mill.
Piccadilly Mill, that's it.
Right. And I believe Piccadilly Mill was part of Corning Fairbanks Mill.
Was it?
Yeah, and I believe it was a grist mill. But that whole area in the late 1700s and maybe early 1800s had a lot of mills there. And that section of town got prosperous because of the mills along it's the Jack Straw Brook and others running into the Cedar Swamp. And because they were prosperous, people used to say, well, they're from Piccadilly, because Piccadilly was the prosperous part of London. So they were set aside as the elite part of Westborough, was Piccadilly out by Hopkinton Road and where Corning Fairbanks.
I always romanticized it before they took the house down. Wouldn't that have been fun to rebuild and have that water running through the house?
Well, the mill was there for quite a while, that structure. And there were other mills. The one that I mentioned on Mill Road, it doesn't exist now, but it was a little further down, I guess. And
is it Lynn Anderson's property down the hole there?
It's Mr. Anderson's property, but it's not where the building is now.
Right.
And there were mills out on Flanders Road as well, some big mills out on Flanders Road. And quite a few on Jack Straw. So they had to have mills. What were they using mills for? Sawmills?
Power, for just to make wheels go round. Anything that would go round, you could put a belt on it and run other things off it.
So you had,
it's like the power takeoff on a tractor. You can run all sorts of things off it.
And in the early 1700s, when they were building, if you look at all the houses that are built in the 1700s, they all are built of boards, lumber.
Right.
So you had to have a sawmill and bring your flour to the grist mill.
Yeah, one of my favorite mills is up in New Brunswick, Queen's Landing they call it. It's a place like Sturbridge Village, and they have a vertical saw that's run off a water wheel.
Okay.
And it would be easily the height of this room, the saw itself, and they'd bring the log in on a carriage into this thing and then run it into this saw that was going up and down, and they would just cut planks endlessly, just pull the carriage and then pull it back and set it again and drive it. And this saw just went on and on and on and on and on.
Amazing.
And not to belabor it, but there was another fellow who had 2 horses on a level platform that would just stand there, and there was a belt that they were standing on. And he had an eccentric on the side of the belt, a wheel, that was attached to a saw that came out the back that he did his firewood with. And when he wanted to get things going, he'd just begin to tilt the front of the stand that the horses were on, and they had to begin to walk.
Oh.
And as they walked, the wheel went around, and the saw would just chug, 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 chug. And guys would sit there on a stump and have a cigarette or whatever, and this horses would chug, 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 slide the log in, do the next one. It was just
great to watch.
It was beautiful. Great ingenuity. The horses loved it. They had no problem. They were getting well fed. The farmers were having fun and kibitzing and at the same time being productive. That's great.
A lot of ingenuity out in New England and everywhere else too, but that's what the mills were. Another person who was very ingenious too was Horace Maynard. Now he came a little later. He came in the 1800s, and what he did was he was born on Maynard Street, in the Maynard house. I think it's 36 Maynard or something like that. And it was a double house at the time. I guess his father owned one side of the house and his father's brother's uncle owned the other side of the house. And they were symmetrical and, I guess, exact copies of each other, the houses. And so the two families lived together. But I believe that Horace Maynard was born, I believe, around 1814. And another very bright young man who went to the one-room schoolhouse at the corner of Otis Street and Fisher. There was Otis and Fisher, there was a one-room schoolhouse. There were 8 one-room schoolhouses, and that was district number 7, I think. So he went there. And then he went to Amherst. And the story is that when he entered Amherst, he reached up and carved a V over his door, or dorm or whatever, and he was going to be valedictorian in 4 years. And he was. A bright Westborough guy. And he also is one, I think, that investigated the story of Hockamaka and wrote that down as part of what he did at Amherst, which was kind of interesting. Yeah. But when he got out of Amherst, he went to Tennessee. I don't know why he went to Tennessee, but he went to Tennessee. And he taught at East Tennessee University, mathematics, and then he studied for the law. And I believe in 1844 or so, he passed the bar and became a lawyer in Knoxville. He was very interested in politics, so he got involved in politics and was elected state representative to the U.S., to the Congress, around 1757 or so. Wow. And what's interesting is he, I think, was for a Union person. He was a Northerner, obviously, and wasn't so excited about Tennessee seceding, and served as a congressman throughout the Civil War, during the Civil War, beginning and after the Civil War. And he had obviously Northern leanings and wanted the Union to stay together, and was rewarded after the Civil War by President Ulysses S. Grant by being named Minister to Turkey from 1875 to 1880. Well, I think somebody should write a great story of Horace Maynard, who came from Westborough and continued to come back to Westborough for his summers at the homestead, and coming from Tennessee, a lawyer from Tennessee, being plopped into Turkey in 1875. I just have visions of harems and great, Persian rugs and as exotic as you possibly can be.
Smoke everywhere.
Oh, he must have been fascinating. Yeah. And he was a good negotiator and probably a skilled diplomat, but what a culture shock that must have been. Yeah. So he was our minister to Turkey for 5 years until 1880. And when he came back, he was so well respected that President Hayes named him Postmaster General of the United States. So he stayed Postmaster General until he died in 1882, only 2 years. And he was going to come back to Westborough, I guess, to retire. His whole plans were to retire back on Maynard Street in the family homestead, but he never did. But he was a very enterprising, brilliant lawyer and statesman. Great. So that's Horace Maynard.
You've got some fascinating stories, Kris.
Well, I haven't got them. The town has them. They're just part of the town history.
I've got to ask you about Robin Hood.
Oh, Robin Hood. We do have a Robin Hood. And, some of these stories are merely brought down as legends. Yeah. But Tom Cook is truly a Robin Hood. And why we're sort of ahead of other towns is that Reverend Ebenezer Parkman wrote down everything in his journals. And we're lucky to have his diaries of Ebenezer Parkman that are published now from the 1700s. And he wrote down the story of Tom Cook, that Tom Cook actually existed in Westborough. Now, who Tom Cook was, he was born in 1732 to a father, I believe, who was a blacksmith. And the house he was born in is now on the corner of East Main Street and Lyman Street. It's called the Plaster House. Right. It is Tom Cook's house. And he grew up, and the legends are that either he was very ill or something happened, and his mother said that the devil could have him if he got well. Whatever the story is, supposedly there was something to do with Tom Cook going on to the bad side. And yet, everybody loved him. So as a young adult, he had the reputation of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And that's why he was called the leveler, because he just leveled everybody's revenue and income right away. And there were many, many stories of him that were passed down, I think, by legend, but the fact that he existed and kept coming to Ebenezer Parkman, or Reverend Ebenezer kept trying to save his soul and wasn't able to, that was written. But some of the stories that I remember was that he would visit people's houses, and they did not want to deal with Tom Cook. And one time, supposedly, he climbed in the second-story window of one of the homes in Westborough and had a great big quilt with him, and just cleared everything out of the second story, you know, just piled everything in his quilt, climbed back out the window, went around front, knocked on the door, and when the woman of the house answered the door and saw Tom Cook, she was very surprised. He said, "Madam, may I leave my bundle here?" And she said, "No, just take the whole thing and get out of here." And off he went, and he robbed her with her permission. So it sounds like something I guess he would do.
Great.
And children followed him everywhere, and he had trinkets and things in his pockets for children. And he escaped by running across a frozen cedar swamp by wearing his shoes backwards so people didn't know which direction he was going in. And there is a story that, a book that's written, a children's book that is written by Jackie Green called The Leveler, that has some of these stories in it. But we do know that he existed, and that Reverend Parkman kept meeting him and trying to bring him back to the fold and to the church, and Tom Cook kept eluding him. And I don't know what happened to him, except that when he died, he was buried in a pauper's grave. So why he's called a Robin Hood is that he didn't keep any of this for himself. He gave away everything he stole. And
Great story.
he lived in Westborough.
Great story.
Good story.
I'm always fascinated by the humor that you can find in so many of these things. I got to tell you one story again about people being ingenious. There was a group of farmers who were haying their field, as they always did, with their scythes. And it was a hot summer day, and they were out scything away and stopping for a drink of water once in a while, but working hard at this. And then this fellow came along with a horse. And behind the horse was this funny-looking rig that he sat on. And he stopped, and he said to the fellows, "You think the way you're haying that field is a good way to do it?" "Sure, that's how we've always done it." And he said, "Would you mind if I showed you a different way?" And what he had was the antique sickle bar that the horse pulled. So the farmers looked at him and kind of scant-eyed and said, "Well, what do you got in mind?" He said, "Well, why don't we do this? Just to show you how efficient you can be with something like this." He said, "Why don't you take a square, measure it off, and then give me an equal-sized square, and you fellas get in there with your scythe, and I'll go with my horse and my scythe, and we'll see who does first and who gets it done better." So they agree. And of course, he beats the pants off him. So these guys, with no hesitation, say, "Well, that was pretty interesting, but you know, that's all on level ground. You know, we have to go up in hills and this kind of stuff." And he said, "Right, mark out another spot on the side of the hill." So they marked out another spot, and he had a spot for his horse, and of course he won again. And I said, "Well, again, that's pretty good, but you know, we have to get real close to walls and go over real rough ground." And he said, "Well, pick out a spot." And of course the horse wins again, and finally the guys say, "Well, the only thing we have left is around the pond." And the guy says, "You've got me cutting this whole field." These farmers did smile on their face. "Yeah, I guess we did."
Very clever.
I think
It is.
that's just great farm ingenuity, humor.
Yeah, and it is farm. And Westborough started off as farms, obviously, in the 1700s, but it relatively quickly became a place of entrepreneurship and industry. And I think people who think that Westborough was a sleepy farm village, it was not. It had people like Gardner Parker in the 1700s, like Whitney in the 1700s, doing all these very interesting inventions, like making clocks, and people starting straw hat factories, and various entrepreneurs settling all around Westborough. First, it started as home industries, that they'd be making these things at home or in home shops, and the whole family might help make shoes or braid straw. For instance, there's a story that the early straw hat factories started in people's homes and then moved to the middle of town, and kids would braid straw for extra money at home. And you would go in, and there was a straw price a bartering. There's a straw price and a regular price for goods in Westborough stores, so that if you had 5 yards of straw, you could barter that for whatever provisions you needed, and then that straw would be used for manufacturing hats. So kids would be doing that at home, and then others might be making shoes at home. But then that also came into town, and there were several shoe factories, shoe and boot factories. So it was a slow transition, but Westborough was well known for its factories and industry right in the middle of town.
Great. Well, you've outlined everything that you suggested we might talk about today, and you've done a fabulous job. I really appreciate it. I'm reluctant to say this is the last time we'll do it, because I'd love to have you come back again sometime.
We have a couple other centuries of personalities.
We've got some other things we need to talk about. And I think it's very important to have this pictorial history of the oral history, but something that people can watch into perpetuity, so that we have a permanent record of this.
I think it's wonderful, because our history is so rich, and there's so many people. I'm very happy that the third graders, the Historical Studies, in fact, this week going to be bringing all the third graders all around town to see the different sites, and we have Leslie going into the schools telling them about their history, so they learn the treasures of Westborough history and how important it is. And more kids are coming in from other parts of the country and other countries themselves, and they don't just grow up with this history, so it's important for us to be able to say they too can be these fabulous entrepreneurs and have all the creativity.
But I hope you'll do again what you used to do with a bus tour, of taking us around and showing us various places in town.
We always do.
We ought to do that periodically, because there's all kinds of new people and lots of us forget.
Me included. It's wonderful to talk to you all the time.
Well, thank you, Kris. I appreciate your taking your time and sharing your wisdom with us, and we relish the thought of having you back.
Yeah, it's fun to talk to you always.
Great. Thank you.